December 18th, 2024, Sacramento Federal Courthouse. The gavel comes down, and with it, 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. But Ronald Dean Yandel? He wasn't backing down, not even now. Standing before the federal judge, this 62-year-old looked straight ahead and declared, "I'm still standing and my life hasn't changed. I ain't easy to kill, and I'll be back before this court on appeal." This moment, this defiant statement from a man who'd spent decades behind bars, this was the culmination of a 5-year federal investigation, an investigation that would expose how America's most dangerous prison gang continued ordering murders, trafficking drugs, and spreading violence, all from their prison cells. What you're about to hear isn't just another crime story. This is the real account of how federal agents, prosecutors, and investigators brought down the leadership of one of the most feared criminal organizations in the American prison system. The Aryan Brotherhood had operated in the shadows for decades, but in 2024 and 2025, their time in those shadows finally came to an end. 7 high-ranking members, multiple life sentences. That's what 2024 and 2025 delivered to the Aryan Brotherhood leadership. But this wasn't just one courthouse, one case, one jurisdiction. No. These operations stretched across California's entire prison system and reached all the way to federal courts. We're talking about a criminal network that had been operating for decades. The victim count? Multiple murders, ordered from prison cells. Inmates who should have been locked away from society, somehow still pulling the strings, still giving the orders, still deciding who lived and who died. So how did investigators finally crack a criminal organization that had managed to stay hidden from law enforcement for so long? How do you bring down people who are already serving life sentences, people who have nothing left to lose? The answer to that question starts with something that changed everything, something that federal agents had been trying to get their hands on for years. And in 2019, they finally got it. To understand how this all came crashing down, you need to meet the people who made it happen, and the people who tried to stop it from happening. First, the prosecutors, U.S. Attorney Philip A. Talpott. This man had been working California's Eastern District for years. He'd seen gang cases before, but nothing quite like this. Then, there's acting U.S. Attorney Michelle Beckwith. Together, these two would lead a prosecution that would span multiple years, multiple trials, and change how federal law enforcement approaches prison gang investigation. But who were they going after? Let me tell you about the defendants. Ronald Dean Yandel, 62 years old, from Pinole, California. This wasn't his first time facing serious charges. 20 years earlier, just weeks after being released from prison, Yandel was arrested for a double homicide in El Sobrante. Murder and manslaughter convictions followed. 65 years to life in state prison, much of that time spent in Pelican Bay's security housing unit. Then there's Francis Clement, 58 years old, Kenneth Johnson, 63. These men weren't just random inmates. They held leadership positions, they made decisions, they gave orders that people followed no matter how far away those people were. On the other side, the investigators who refused to give up. DEA Special Agent Brian M. Clark. This man understood that stopping drug trafficking meant going after the source, even when that source was behind prison walls. Working alongside the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation CDCR officers who saw what was happening inside their facilities every single day. For years, these investigators had been trying to build cases. They knew the crimes were happening, they knew who was responsible, but they couldn't prove it, they couldn't get close enough, they couldn't get inside the organization. But in 2019, something changed. Federal agents had obtained something they'd never had before. March 2019. federal courthouses across California, one by one, indictments were being unsealed. Names that had been whispered in prison yards for decades were now being read aloud in federal court. But what had changed? What gave federal prosecutors the confidence to finally move forward with these cases? The answer was right there in the defendants' prison cells. Now, you might be thinking, how hard could it be to keep phones out of a maximum security prison? But here's what investigators discovered. These weren't just inmates making casual calls to family members. No, these were sophisticated criminal operations being coordinated from behind bars. Ronald Yandel and William Sylvester sharing a cell at California State Prison, Sacramento. From that single cell, they were directing drug trafficking operations that stretched across multiple states. Heroin, methamphetamine, moving through California's cities, Sacramento, and beyond. Think about that for a moment. Two men locked in a cell, somehow managing to control criminal activities hundreds of miles away. They were ordering murders, they were settling disputes, they were approving new gang members, all through these smuggled phones. And John Stinson? He was using his contraband cell phone to conduct business on behalf of the organization, resolving conflicts between members, sponsoring people for gang membership, making decisions that would determine whether someone lived or died. But here's what these defendants didn't know. While they thought they were having private conversations, while they believed their communications were secure, investigators were listening to every single word. November 30th, 2020, a federal courthouse in California. A man named Samuel Keaton, 45 years old, from Menifee, stood before a judge and said two words that would change everything. Guilty, Your Honor. Keaton was the first of 16 defendants named in that March 2019 indictment to break, to admit what he'd been doing, to tell prosecutors exactly how this operation worked. And what had Samuel Keaton been doing? He was a courier, a drug courier, moving methamphetamine and cash between some very dangerous people. But this wasn't street-level dealing. This wasn't some small-time operation. Keaton was maintaining the flow, the constant flow, of heroin and methamphetamine between Ronald Yandel and William Sylvester in their Sacramento prison cell, and another defendant named Travis Burhop. Money going one direction, drugs going the other, a pipeline that federal agents now realize had been operating for years. But here's what made Keaton's guilty plea so important to prosecutors. It wasn't just about getting one conviction. Federal prosecutors had a strategy. They were building these cases from the bottom up. Start with the couriers, the people moving the drugs, the people handling the money. Get them to cooperate and work your way up the chain. Because at the top of that chain, the real targets, the people giving the orders, the people who thought they were untouchable because they were already behind bars. Keaton's cooperation gave prosecutors something they'd never had before, a window inside the operation. Real names, real methods, real evidence of how these prison inmates were coordinating criminal activities on the outside. Remember Keaton's cooperation, because this detail becomes critical later. What prosecutors learned from him would help them understand just how many people had died because of orders that came from prison cells. July 28, 2018. High Desert State Prison. A place where inmates are supposed to be kept away from society, where they're supposed to be unable to harm anyone else. But on this day, violence erupted inside those walls, and when it was over, a man was dead. Two inmates carried out this murder. Pat Brady, 53 years old, from Paradise. These weren't random cellmates who got into a fight. This wasn't a dispute that got out of hand. No, this was planned. This was ordered. This was an execution. The victim, Donald Pequin. Inmates called him Joker. And Joker had made a fatal mistake. He'd been claiming to be a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, but he wasn't. It was a lie that allowed him to run up significant drug debt that he thought his fake gang affiliation would protect him from having to pay. But the Aryan Brotherhood, they don't tolerate lies. They don't tolerate people using their name. And they definitely don't tolerate people who owe them money and think they can just walk away. So Brady and Corbett, they received their orders, and on July 28 they carried them out. Paquetan was stabbed to death, murdered inside what was supposed to be a secure facility, killed by men who were already serving life sentences, men who had nothing left to lose. When prosecutors filed charges against Brady and Corbett, when they started building their cases, they thought they were dealing with a single murder, a terrible crime, but an isolated incident. California State Prison, Sacramento, building after building of concrete and steel, razor wire guard towers, maximum security, and in one of those cells, a cell that should have been isolating two dangerous criminals from society, was actually the headquarters of a multi-state criminal enterprise, Ronald Yandel and William Sylvester, cellmates. But these two weren't just passing time behind bars. Between 2011 and 2016, from that single prison cell, they were running a sophisticated drug trafficking operation that reached across California and beyond. Heroin, methamphetamine, moving through Sacramento, moving through other California cities, a pipeline that generated thousands of dollars, money that somehow found its way back to two men who were supposed to be cut off from the outside world. You're probably wondering, how do you maintain control over criminal operations across such distances when you're locked in a maximum security prison cell? How do you coordinate drug deals? How do you collect money? How do you make sure people follow your orders when you can't physically be there to enforce them? The answer was right there in their cell: smuggled cell phones. But this wasn't just about getting phones past the guards. This was about creating a communication network that correctional officers couldn't detect, couldn't monitor, couldn't shut down. These phones were small enough to hide, sophisticated enough to make calls anywhere in the country, and secure enough, or so Yandel and Sylvester thought, to allow them to conduct business without law enforcement listening in. But they weren't just moving drugs. They were making life and death decisions, murder orders, actual orders to kill people. And those orders weren't just being carried out inside prison walls. People on the streets, people who had never been to prison, were dying because of decisions made in that Sacramento cell. Think about what that means. Two men already serving life sentences, somehow finding ways to reach outside those prison walls and end human lives. They were resolving disputes, they were punishing people who crossed them, they were eliminating threats to their operation. And federal investigators? They had no idea how far this network actually reached until they started listening to those phone calls. Los Angeles County. Streets that should have been hundreds of miles away from any prison influence. But between 2020 and 2022, 5 people were murdered on these streets, 5 separate killings. And every single one of them, every single one, was ordered by inmates who were locked away in maximum security facilities. October 4th, 2020, Lomita, California, 2 men are shot to death. Awan Roshansky, Ruslan Magomed Gadjev. These weren't random victims of street crime. These weren't robberies gone wrong. These were targeted assassinations, ordered by Kenneth Johnson and Francis Clement, working together from their prison cells. But how? How does an inmate serving a life sentence reach outside prison walls and arrange for people to be killed on the streets of Los Angeles County? The method was horrifyingly simple. Johnson and Clement would use their smuggled cell phones to contact associates on the outside. People who weren't in prison, people who could move freely, people who were willing to carry out orders, no matter how violent those orders were. These weren't complicated conspiracies. There were no elaborate codes, no secret meetings. Johnson and Clement would simply call their contacts, explain who needed to be eliminated and why. The victims had either violated gang rules, or they owed money, or they had somehow crossed the organization. Francis Clement, he didn't stop with those two murders. In February 2022, he ordered the killing of Michael Brizendine. The following month, March 2022, Clement ordered 2 more murders, James Yeagle, Ronnie Ennis, 3 more people dead because of phone calls made from a prison cell. Think about what this means for public safety. These inmates were supposed to be isolated from society. They were serving life sentences specifically to prevent them from committing more crimes. But through these smuggled phones, they were reaching across hundreds of miles and ending lives. And federal investigators, they were recording every single conversation, building a case that would prove beyond any doubt that prison walls meant absolutely nothing to these defendants. Court-authorized surveillance. Those are 3 words that change everything in a federal investigation. It means federal agents aren't just guessing. They're not relying on informants who might be lying. They're not building cases on circumstantial evidence. They're listening to actual conversations, real phone calls, actual criminal planning happening in real time. And what federal agents heard when they started monitoring those prison cell phones? It was worse than anything they had imagined. John Stinson, 70 years old, already serving a lengthy sentence in the California state prison system. But Stinson wasn't just another inmate. He was conducting business, important business, using his contraband cell phone to make decisions that affected people across multiple states. Investigators heard Stinson sponsoring new gang members. They heard him resolving disputes between existing members. They heard him approving murders of current and former gang associates, all caught on court-authorized wiretaps, all admissible in federal court. But what really shocked investigators was what these recordings revealed about the organization itself. For decades, law enforcement had suspected that the Aryan Brotherhood had some kind of leadership structure, but they'd never been able to prove it. They'd never been able to identify exactly who was making the decisions. The wiretaps changed all of that. They revealed a 3-man commission. 3 inmates who sat at the top of the organization, 3 people who had the authority to order killings, to settle internal disputes, to decide who lived and who died. John Stinson was one of those 3 commission members, and federal agents, they were recording his conversations, they were documenting his decisions, they were building an ironclad case against someone who thought he was untouchable. But meanwhile, while investigators were analyzing hours of recorded phone calls, while they were mapping out the organizational structure, while they were identifying targets for prosecution, they had uncovered something even more disturbing. Something that would prove these prison inmates weren't just ordering murders, they were running a criminal enterprise that had tentacles reaching into communities across the entire state of California. April 2024, Sacramento Federal Courthouse. After 5 years of investigation, after countless hours of recorded phone calls, after building cases against multiple defendants, federal prosecutors were finally ready to present their evidence to a jury. 9 weeks. That's how long this trial would last. 9 weeks of testimony. 9 weeks of evidence. 9 weeks of revealing to the public exactly how a criminal organization had been operating from inside maximum security prison cells. But prosecutors weren't just charging these defendants with individual crimes. They weren't just saying this person committed this murder or that person sold these drugs. No, they were using something much more powerful, something called RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO, it's a federal law that allows prosecutors to go after entire criminal organizations, not just individual criminals, but the enterprise itself, the structure, the hierarchy, the ongoing pattern of criminal activity. And to prove RICO conspiracy, prosecutors had to show that these defendants were working together as an organization to commit multiple crimes over an extended period of time. The evidence? Cell phone records, hundreds of recorded conversations, financial transactions showing money moving from drug sales back to prison accounts, and witness testimony from people who had been inside the organization, people who were now cooperating with federal authorities. But who exactly were they prosecuting? Let's talk about Ronald Yandel. This wasn't his first time facing serious criminal charges. 20 years earlier, just weeks after being released from prison, Yandel was arrested for a double homicide in El Sobrante, California. 2 people dead. Murder and manslaughter convictions followed, a sentence of 65 years to life in state prison. Most of that time was spent in Pelican Bay's security housing unit. Solitary confinement, 23 hours a day in a concrete cell. But even there, even in the most restrictive housing unit in the California prison system, Yandel found ways to maintain his criminal activities. The prosecution was methodical, witness after recording, recording after recording, financial document after financial document, building a case that would prove these defendants weren't just individual criminals. They were leaders of a criminal enterprise that had caused deaths both inside prison walls and on the streets of California. But here's what prosecutors didn't know yet. Even as they were presenting evidence against these defendants, even as they were building what they thought was a comprehensive case against the Aryan Brotherhood leadership, more defendants were about to fall, more trials were coming, and the full scope of this criminal organization was about to be revealed. April 30th, 2024. After 9 weeks of testimony, after months of deliberation by federal prosecutors, after years of investigation, a federal jury was ready to deliver their verdict. Guilty. Guilty on RICO conspiracy, guilty on murder in aid of racketeering, guilty on drug trafficking charges. Ronald Yandel, the man who had declared he was still standing, convicted. William Sylvester, his cellmate and co-conspirator, convicted. Danny Troxell, another high-ranking gang leader, convicted. 3 men who thought they were untouchable because they were already serving life sentences. 3 men who believed that prison walls would protect them from federal prosecution. 3 men who were wrong. The specific charges? Murder in aid of racketeering. That means the jury found that these defendants had committed murders, or ordered murders, to advance the goals of their criminal organization. Drug trafficking. That means the jury believed the evidence that these inmates were coordinating the movement of heroin and methamphetamine from their prison cells. U.S. Attorney Philip Tolbert didn't waste time responding to the verdicts. Today's convictions further our effort to dismantle a violent criminal enterprise run from inside California prisons, he said. The Aryan Brotherhood controlled its members, associates and others both inside and outside prison walls, ordering multiple murders and running a drug trafficking operation that spanned counties and states. But the defense attorneys, they weren't giving up. Not even close. Appeal after appeal was being promised. Claims that the evidence was insufficient. Claims that their clients had been unfairly targeted. Claims that the government had overreached. Stephen Cale, Yandel's attorney, argued that his client had been the victim of retaliation by prison guards, that 11 years in solitary confinement had broken him down, that the prosecution was more about politics than justice. The defendants themselves? They showed no remorse, no acknowledgement of the lives that had been lost because of their orders, no recognition of the families that had been destroyed by their criminal enterprise. These convictions were significant, but they were just the beginning, because federal prosecutors had more trials coming, more defendants to prosecute, and more evidence to present that would reveal the full scope of how this organization had been operating. The defendants themselves. They showed no remorse, no acknowledgement of the lives that had been lost because of their orders, no recognition of the families that had been destroyed by their criminal enterprise. Meanwhile, the courthouse was finished in Fresno, California. The prosecution wasn't finished, not even close. 3 more defendants were about to face trial: Francis Clement, Kenneth Johnson, John Stinson, men who thought they had watched their co-conspirators get convicted and somehow believed they would escape the same fate. 4 weeks. That's how long this trial would last. 4 weeks of evidence that would prove these defendants weren't just members of a criminal organization, they were leaders, decision makers, people who held the power of life and death over others. But what made this trial different, what made this prosecution even more powerful, was the witness testimony. Former gang members were breaking their vows of silence. People who had spent decades following orders were now giving those orders up to federal prosecutors. And then there was James Field. This man had tattooed stitches over his lips, actual tattoos, stitches across his mouth as a symbol, a vow that he would never reveal the secrets of the Aryan Brotherhood. He had dreamed of joining this organization, he had robbed for them, he had extorted for them, he had killed for them. But now, James Field was sitting in a federal courthouse, speaking under oath, telling a jury exactly how this organization operated, breaking that vow of silence, revealing secrets that he had sworn to take to his grave. Field testified about the hierarchy, about how orders were given, about how murders were planned and carried out, about how these defendants, these 3 men sitting at the defense table, had the authority to decide who lived and who died. When it came time for closing arguments, when federal prosecutors had presented all their evidence, Assistant U.S. Attorney Stephanie Stockman stood before that jury and said 4 words that captured everything. They rule on fear and power, not respect, not loyalty, fear and power, the threat of violence, the promise of retaliation, the knowledge that crossing these defendants meant death. The jury deliberated for 3 days. 3 days of reviewing evidence, 3 days of considering testimony, 3 days of deciding whether the government had proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt. February 15, 2025. Guilty. Guilty on all major counts. Francis Clement, convicted of RICO conspiracy and 5 separate counts of murder in aid of racketeering. Kenneth Johnson, convicted of RICO conspiracy and 2 counts of murder in aid of racketeering. John Stinson, convicted of RICO conspiracy. The verdicts were in. The evidence had been presented. The juries had spoken. But the most dramatic moments, the moments that would truly reveal who these defendants really were yet to come in the sentencing hearings. December 18, 2024. We're back where this story started. Sacramento Federal Courthouse, U.S. District Judge Kimberly J. Mueller presiding. Ronald Yandel and William Sylvester standing before the bench, waiting to learn how they would spend the rest of their lives. The courtroom was packed. Federal agents who had spent years building this case, prosecutors who had dedicated months to these trials, family members of victims who had waited years for this moment. Judge Mueller was methodical, professional. She reviewed the evidence, she considered the arguments from both sides, and then she delivered the sentences that would ensure these defendants never had another opportunity to hurt anyone. Ronald Yandel, 2 consecutive life terms in federal prison. William Sylvester, 2 consecutive life terms in federal prison, no possibility of parole, no chance of release, no opportunity to continue the criminal activities that had defined their adult lives. But Yandel, even at this moment, even as he was being sentenced to spend the rest of his life in federal custody, he remained defiant. "I'm still standing, and my life hasn't changed," he told the judge. "I ain't easy to kill, and I'll be back before this court on appeal." The victim impact was staggering. Communities across California that had been flooded with methamphetamine and heroin because of orders that came from these defendants' prison cells, families that had lost loved ones to drug overdoses, neighborhoods that had been terrorized by violence connected to this organization. The defense arguments: claims of political retaliation. Yandel's attorney, Stephen Kaller, argued that 11 years in solitary confinement had produced the man who sat before the court, that prison guards had retaliated against his client, that this prosecution was about politics rather than justice. But Judge Mueller wasn't buying it. The evidence was overwhelming. The crimes were real, the victims were real, and the sentences reflected the serious nature of what these defendants had done. May 19, 2025, Federal Courthouse in Fresno. Different judge, different defendants, but the same outcome: justice. U.S. District Judge Jennifer L. Thurston was presiding over what would be the final chapter in this prosecution. Francis Clement, Kenneth Johnson, and John Stinson standing before her, waiting to learn their fate. Francis Clement, 58 years old, convicted of RICO conspiracy and 5 separate counts of murder in aid of racketeering. Judge Thurston's sentence: life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Kenneth Johnson, 63 years old, convicted of RICO conspiracy and 2 counts of murder in aid of racketeering. Judge Thurston's sentence: life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. 70 years old, already serving a lengthy sentence in the California state prison system, convicted of RICO conspiracy. Judge Thurston's sentence: 20 years in federal prison, 20 additional years to be served after his state sentence was completed. Matthew Glailiotti, head of the Justice Department's Criminal Division, didn't mince words in his response to these sentences. The convicted defendants led a notorious prison gang that committed ruthless murders, widespread methamphetamine trafficking, and perpetuated a culture of mayhem, fear, and disorder within the prison system that bled into the outside world. Organized crime within the prison system, enabled by the use of contraband cell phones, endangers American neighborhoods by flooding streets with dangerous drugs. The criminal division will continue to pursue crime syndicates like the Aryan Brotherhood and their facilitators to ensure they go to prison and the harm they inflict on society ends once incarcerated. 7 defendants, multiple life sentences, a criminal organization that had operated for decades, finally brought to justice. But what did these sentences mean for the communities that had been affected? And what did they mean for the future of organized crime prosecution? Remember those cell phones we mentioned earlier? The smuggled phones that started this entire investigation? They were the key to everything. Without those recorded conversations, without that court-authorized surveillance, without federal agents listening to every word, these defendants might still be coordinating criminal activities from their prison cells. So where do these defendants stand today? That's complicated. Despite receiving federal sentences, despite being convicted in federal court, most of these defendants remain in the California state prison system. The Federal Bureau of Prisons hasn't accepted them yet. Ronald Yandel is still in state custody. William Sylvester, same situation. Even Brant Daniel, who pleaded guilty over a year ago, expecting to go to federal prison, he's still waiting. The remaining defendants, Kevin McNamara, Jason Weaver, Waylon Pitchford, all still awaiting trial, all preparing their defenses, all facing the possibility of spending the rest of their lives in federal custody. Appeals are already being filed, defense attorneys arguing evidence was insufficient, claiming prosecutorial overreach. But federal prosecutors are confident these convictions will stand. This investigation changed how law enforcement approaches prison gang prosecutions. Multi-agency cooperation between the DEA, federal prosecutors, and the California Department of Corrections. Sharing information, coordinating strategies, working together. The technology factor cannot be overstated. Cell phone surveillance gave investigators access to conversations they never could have obtained before, real-time criminal planning, actual murder orders, evidence that couldn't be disputed. But prison security challenges remain. Contraband cell phones are still getting into facilities. Inmates are still finding ways to communicate with the outside world. This case won't be the last of its kind. 7 major figures now facing life in federal custody. Streets and prisons safer because these defendants can no longer coordinate criminal activities. Communities protected from drug trafficking operations that had operated for decades. This 5-year investigation proved something important, something that criminal organizations need to understand, something that future defendants should remember. The walls of a prison do not shield violent gang leaders from justice. Federal law enforcement agencies will continue monitoring, continue investigating, continue prosecuting, because public safety doesn't end when someone gets sent to prison. If you or someone you know has been affected by gang violence or drug trafficking, victim support resources are available through the U.S. Attorney's Office. Information on ongoing cases can be found through the Department of Justice website.